Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be exploring something pretty important, I think, the emotional impact of racial issues.
Yeah.
And we're going to be looking at this blog post. It's called Understanding the Emotional Impact of Racial Issues.
Okay.
And it's really packed with insights, I think.
Yeah, looks like it.
Yeah, so get ready to unpack how racism shapes how people feel. Not just like individuals, but like whole communities.
Yeah, it's so easy to kind of get lost in the headlines and, all the statistics.
Right.
But I think this deep dive is going to help us remember that racial issues are very personal.
Yeah.
It's about human experiences.
Yeah, for sure.
That's what we're going to be focusing on.
Yeah, and this blog post really, it gets right to the point.
Yeah.
It argues that racial issues aren't just, those abstract problems that are just sort of out there.
Right.
It says they really hit people where it hurts, emotionally.
Totally. And the post names a whole bunch of emotions, too. Anger, sadness, frustration, anxiety, helplessness. I mean, all these.
It's a lot.
Yeah. But what I think is really interesting is that it goes beyond just listing them. It makes you think about why these emotions are so common in the first place.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what you think about that. I was really struck by the connection between, those emotions and like the historical context.
Yeah.
It's not just what's happening today.
Oh, absolutely not. It's about the past, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the blog post goes through this timeline, starting with the slave trade, moving through abolition, Jim Crow,
Right.
civil rights era. Each period had its own unique challenges,
Right.
but they all feed into, I guess, like this emotional legacy we're dealing with.
So you're saying it's like more than just dates and events.
Yeah.
It's how this trauma from all this injustice
Yeah.
just echoes through the generations.
Right.
And shapes how people feel even today.
Absolutely. That's a great way to put it. The post actually uses the term collective trauma to describe it. Like if your ancestors had endured centuries of oppression, how could that not affect you now?
Right.
It becomes part of your family's story, your community's identity.
It really makes you think like how much of our present day, anxieties or mistrust stems from that shared trauma.
Yeah.
It's pretty heavy stuff to think about.
Yeah, it is.
But it seems really important to understand just the emotional landscape we're all navigating.
It is. It really is. It leads into the post's main point.
Yeah.
The specific ways racism impacts people emotionally. One of the first emotions it talks about is anger.
Okay.
Which I think we can all agree is a pretty natural response to injustice.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you feel like you're being treated unfairly, your voice isn't heard.
Yeah.
Anger makes sense.
Of course. Makes total sense. But the post also says that anger can be kind of a double-edged sword.
Well, how so?
It can be a really powerful motivator for positive change. But if it's not channeled in the right way, it can lead to burnout, despair, even violence.
It's like it needs to be harnessed productively.
Exactly.
Which I imagine is really hard.
It is.
When you're dealing with such, deep-rooted oppression,
Absolutely.
it's not just about your own feelings, it's about the whole system.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. And so alongside anger, the post talks about sadness as another big emotional response.
Right.
And it's interesting because it connects sadness to like this really deep sense of loss.
Yeah. Loss of identity.
Loss of what specifically?
Loss of identity, belonging, even dignity. The post says that when you're constantly being told you're less than because of your race, it really takes a toll on your self-worth. It's like a part of you is being taken away.
That's a really powerful image.
Yeah.
I've heard people talk about feeling invisible or less than because of their race.
Right.
And it's like a sadness that's more than just feeling down.
Yeah.
It's like you said, it's about your identity.
Absolutely. And this is where the post starts to connect these feelings to mental health.
Okay. We'll talk more about that later, but it's clear that this kind of sadness has serious consequences.
It makes sense. I mean, it's not just about feelings.
Yeah.
It's about how those feelings can impact your mental health, your physical health over time.
Totally. And building on that, the post then goes into anxiety as a response to racial issues. It talks about the constant fear of discrimination, those microaggressions we talked about earlier, and how they take away your sense of safety and security.
Like you're always bracing for the next slight.
Yeah.
I remember reading about this study that showed how this constant vigilance, it can actually change your brain chemistry.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's like when you're always on alert for racism, your nervous system is in overdrive, and that fight or flight response is constantly activated.
I see.
which can obviously lead to like chronic stress and all sorts of other health problems.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not just about feeling bad in the moment.
Right.
It's about these long-term consequences.
Exactly. And to kind of round out this picture of emotions, the post talks about helplessness.
Okay.
That feeling that no matter what you do, nothing changes.
Nothing you do will make a difference.
Exactly. And that can make people just withdraw from social and political engagement.
What's the point?
Right.
Yeah, what's the point?
If you think the system is rigged against you.
Exactly. So we've got anger, sadness, anxiety, helplessness. All these emotions are so intertwined.
Yeah, and they all have real consequences.
They do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess the question becomes, how do people cope with this?
Yeah, how do you find resilience
when
you're dealing with all of that? Well, that's what we'll talk about next.
Okay.
The post goes into a lot of detail about coping mechanisms.
Okay, cool.
Both healthy and unhealthy.
I'm ready to hear more about that, and also I'm curious to see how this post talks about intersectionality.
Because it's not just about race, is it?
Exactly.
It's about how race interacts with all the other parts of a person's identity.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's not just about race in isolation. We have to look at how it connects with gender, with class, sexual orientation, all these other parts of who a person is.
Yeah, it's like adding all these extra layers of complexity onto an already complex issue.
Right. And the point the post is making is that seeing these overlapping identities, it's not just some academic thing.
Right.
It's about understanding people's actual experiences, you know, when they're facing multiple kinds of oppression.
So it's like, instead of talking about racism as this big general thing, we need to be way more specific.
Yeah, we need to get into those nuances.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the post gives this example of a Black woman.
Okay.
Her experience is going to be different from a Black man's or a white woman's, right?
Right.
She's dealing with a world where both her race and her gender can make her a target.
Yeah. So it's like she's facing bias from multiple directions.
Exactly. And they kind of amplify each other.
Right.
And the post uses this term, cumulative stressors.
Okay.
It's not just dealing with one kind of oppression. It's all of them piling up on top of each other.
Yeah. It makes you think about how much more resilience you would need to handle all of that. And to me, it also highlights the need for safe spaces.
Yes.
Where people can be their full selves without fear of judgment.
Absolutely. And that takes us to the post's discussion about coping mechanisms.
Okay.
Because when you're facing that constant emotional weight, you need healthy ways to deal with it, you know?
Right, to build some resilience.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some of those healthy ways? Well, the post really stresses the importance of social support.
Okay.
Leaning on your community, friends, family, people who get it.
Yeah, people who understand.
Yeah, and who can just offer a listening ear or some solidarity.
There's something really powerful about knowing you're not alone in this stuff.
Totally. Sharing those experiences can be really validating, you know? It helps fight that feeling of isolation.
It reminds me of that idea of collective healing.
Yeah.
When people come together and share their stories and support each other.
Yeah, I love that.
It's like an antidote to all of that trauma.
Exactly. And along with individual connections, the post also talks about community activities.
Okay.
Like joining a social justice organization, or participating in cultural events, or even just volunteering in your neighborhood.
So it's like finding those places where you feel like you belong.
Yes.
And where you can celebrate your identity.
Absolutely.
And channel that energy into something good.
You got it. And I think that's a key difference between the healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Okay, what's that?
Healthy coping is about finding ways to process your emotions that actually empower you.
Okay.
And not lead to more isolation or self-destruction.
Got it.
So what are some of those unhealthy ways? Well, the post talks about substance abuse and social withdrawal. You know, when you're feeling overwhelmed, it's tempting to try to numb the pain with drugs or alcohol.
Or just shut down completely.
Yeah. And while those things might give you temporary relief, they don't really solve anything.
Right. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
That's a great way to put it.
It might cover it up for a bit.
Yeah.
But it won't actually heal.
No. And that's why the post really encourages people to get professional help when they need it. Therapy can provide a safe space to process those emotions.
Right.
To learn some healthy coping skills.
Yeah.
And to work through any trauma.
I think it's so important to say that seeking help isn't weak.
Totally.
It's a sign of strength.
Absolutely.
Especially in communities where mental health is stigmatized.
Yeah, I agree. It's about saying it's okay to need support.
Right.
And there are people who can help you.
Yeah, for sure. So we talked about social support.
Right.
We talked about community.
Yeah.
Now the post also talks about education as a way to combat racism.
Yes. Education is so important.
I totally agree. I think it's the most powerful weapon we have against all this ignorance and prejudice.
It's about giving people the tools they need to fight those biases.
Exactly.
And to understand different perspectives and to empathize.
I love how you put that. It's not about indoctrinating people.
No.
It's about teaching them to think for themselves.
Exactly.
And to have meaningful discussions.
Yeah, for sure. And the post gives some specific examples.
Okay.
It talks about diversity education in schools.
Uh-huh.
So kids learn about different cultures and histories early on.
Yes, start early.
Yeah, that early exposure is so important.
Totally.
It helps break down stereotypes and build respect for difference.
And the post also talks about community outreach programs.
Yes.
That can create those spaces for dialogue.
Right.
And understanding.
Exactly. And those kinds of initiatives are crucial for bridging those divides.
Right.
And fostering a sense of shared humanity.
Yeah, it's about getting out of those echo chambers.
Yeah.
And actually engaging with the world in all of its diversity.
Well said. And while education is crucial, the post does say it's not a quick fix.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing process.
Right.
That needs constant effort and lifelong learning.
So it's about constantly questioning our own biases, seeking out different viewpoints, and having those tough conversations.
Exactly. It's about realizing that we'll never be done learning about race and racism.
Yeah, it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that leads us to the post's call to action.
Okay.
Because it's not enough to just understand the problem.
Yeah.
We have to work towards solutions.
I mean, it can be overwhelming, right?
It is. It is.
When you think about tackling something so big.
For sure.
But I do believe even small actions can make a difference.
They can.
It's about finding ways to use our voices, our resources, to make the world a little bit more just.
Yeah, I love that.
And a little bit more equitable.
Absolutely. And you know, that reminds me of a quote by Audre Lorde.
Oh, yeah.
She said, "Your silence will not protect you."
That's powerful.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder that we can't just sit back and hope someone else will fix this.
We all have a role to play.
We do.
Yeah. And that makes me think about the responsibility we each have to confront our own biases.
Yeah. That inner work is essential.
Yeah.
But it's also important to remember that individual action isn't enough.
Right.
We need systemic change, too.
So challenging discriminatory policies.
Exactly.
Advocating for more representation.
Yes.
Dismantling those structures that keep all of this going.
You got it. It's about working on both fronts.
Yeah, individual and collective action.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes this deep dive so important.
Yeah.
It's not just about understanding the problem, it's about solutions.
Yeah.
And empowering people to take action.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the power we have when we work together.
Absolutely. So before we move on to the post's conclusion,
Okay.
I'm curious what educational experiences have been most impactful for you?
Well, that's a great question. One of the most powerful experiences I had was actually talking to my grandmother.
Oh, wow.
You know, she grew up in the Jim Crow South.
Yeah.
And her stories about segregation and discrimination, it really brought home the reality of racism in a way that no book ever could.
There's just something about those personal stories
that
makes it all so real.
Right. And for me, that conversation with her was like a turning point. It made me want to learn more about history.
Yeah.
Social justice, the fight for equality.
That's amazing.
What about you? Were there any educational experiences that really shaped your understanding?
Yeah, for me, it was a college course I took on the history of race and racism in America.
Oh, wow.
It was eye-opening to learn how race has been used to justify oppression throughout our history.
Right. It's like learning about how all of that was constructed.
Exactly. And the professor really pushed us to think about how those historical patterns are still playing out today.
So it wasn't just about memorizing dates.
No, it was about connecting the past to the present.
Yeah.
You know, things like mass incarceration.
Right.
Economic inequality.
Right.
Voting rights.
Yeah, for sure. It's like the past is never really past, is it?
No, it isn't. It shapes everything.
And we all have a responsibility to challenge those systems.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the post's call to action.
Okay.
Understanding history is just the first step.
Right.
We need to use that knowledge to act.
Yeah, make a difference.
Right.
So I think that's a good place to pause for now.
Okay.
I think we've covered a lot.
We have.
But there's still so much more to unpack.
There is.
So in the next part of our deep dive, we'll get into the post's conclusion.
Sounds good.
And talk about what we can all do to contribute to healing and allyship. Okay, so we've talked about the emotions tied up in all of this, the history, the importance of support systems, the power of education. And it's clear this goes way beyond just saying racism is bad.
It really does. It gets to something much deeper. I think this blog post and our conversation today have really shown just how personal and how widespread the impact of racism really is. It's not just something out there. It's part of our everyday lives. It affects how we feel, our mental health, even our physical health.
One thing that keeps sticking with me is that idea of collective trauma from the post.
Yeah.
I think we need to unpack that a little more. It feels really key to understanding how the past shapes the present.
Yeah.
It's
definitely key. And it's complex, too. Think of it this way. Imagine a family where there's been abuse. Even after it stops, the effects are still there.
Right.
There's that shared hurt, that feeling like you always have to be on guard, maybe even trouble trusting people. Yeah. Collective trauma is kind of like that, but on a much bigger scale.
So instead of one family, it's whole communities carrying the weight of all that injustice.
Exactly. It's not just one person's pain. It's a shared wound. And like any wound, it needs attention if it's going to heal. The blog post connects this trauma to those mental health disparities we see. Higher rates of certain conditions in minority communities, and even things like physical health outcomes.
It makes me think about those studies that show how chronic stress, the kind you get from navigating a world where you might face discrimination any day, can actually affect your heart, your immune system, even your DNA.
Yeah.
It's not just in your mind. It's like it gets into your body.
Exactly. And that's why the post doesn't just describe the problem. It calls for action, both personal and systemic. Creating spaces for healing, recognizing the pain, but also tearing down the systems that cause that pain.
So it's more than just therapy or support groups,
yeah.
although those are important too.
Absolutely.
But it's also about going after those root causes,
right.
Those policies and practices that keep disadvantaging people based on race.
Exactly. It has to be multi-pronged.
So the blog post is saying we need both inner work, looking at our own biases, and outward action, challenging the systems.
Absolutely. It can feel overwhelming, I know.
It really can.
But it's about those small steps, adding up to something much bigger.
And that's where community comes in, right?
Yes. The post talked about it as a coping mechanism, but it's also what fuels collective action. Joining with people who share your values makes it less scary to act.
Right, you feel that solidarity, like you're not alone.
Exactly. It makes a huge difference. To be honest, reading this post and having this conversation has really made me think I need to be more proactive myself.
Yeah.
More intentional about finding those communities, those places where I can actually make a difference. It's not about feeling guilty. It's about using my privilege to help lift up the voices of people who are being marginalized.
I think that's a really powerful insight. Yeah. And it gets to the heart of what this post is saying. It's not just about feeling bad about racism. It's about turning that feeling into action, recognizing that we all have a part to play in making things more just and more fair.
Absolutely. We all have that power.
So to wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question, something to think about. It builds on the post, but takes it a step further. What does healing from this collective trauma look like for you? What can you do in your own life and in your community to be a part of that healing?
That's a great question. And I'll add this. Hold on to hope. It's easy to get discouraged when you see how big these problems are. But hope is what keeps us going. It reminds us that a better future is possible, and that our actions, no matter how small, can help build that future.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's given you a lot to think about. And remember, this conversation doesn't end here. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for change.